folks. Welcome to the 5th episode of The Monk and the Mechanic. My name is Kylie, and I'm the monk.
And I'm the mechanic, Josh. This episode is about the afterlife. So here to join us today for an afterlife discussion is
a ghost.
Right? If that was possible, that would be we would be solving all the problems,
right.
Finding that we've got
We're interviewing a ghost today. You heard it here first, folks.
Right.
After an alien on last week's episode.
Right.
Yeah, it was a real alien last week. So
we should have rethought this. I don't know.
Now,
maybe we should have had a ghost. But instead, we've got Malcolm Fox.
Mm-hmm.
So, Malcolm, tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit of background.
Hey there, guys. Thanks for having me. I am 21 years old. I'm a religion major, currently studying at Trinity University. I am friends with you guys through some mutual kind of meditation interests, and I was really excited to hear about this podcast.
It's okay to say woke house.
Yeah.
You can plug woke
Okay,
house
Okay,
on
fine,
the air.
fine. All right.
WOKE-house.org.
Yeah, exactly. Bodhisattva Press, right?
On
Yes.
Facebook, yeah.
Exactly. So, I think that these are things that I've been wondering about all my life, the exact kind of things that you guys talk about on this podcast, and that's kind of what motivated me to major in religion as well. I do some nonprofit work career-wise. I'm an avid meditator myself, so I'm excited to kind of get into this discussion with you guys today.
Awesome. Well, welcome. So we're going to be talking about the afterlife. So we're not going to just be very specific on one type of afterlife. I mean, if we want to talk about Valhalla or anything like that, I mean, absolutely any subject is up for debate as long as we get it all figured out and we have solved all the world's problems. We can explain to everyone exactly what the afterlife is and what they have to expect. I think that's reasonable, right?
Yep.
I'm taking notes.
Okay, cool. So I think first we should probably talk, since this we have a Buddhist monk here with us, maybe we could talk about reincarnation first. What is the Buddhist standpoint on reincarnation?
Can't we talk about that in my next life? Actually, what I found interesting this morning, it came up on my phone, on my feed, that they found did you see this, Malcolm? In a stupa in India, they found this little scroll made out of bark. It's 2,000 years old. And so they found it. They said that it was in some part of Afghanistan. It used to be called, what was the name of it?
Bamiyan?
No, Dadara or something. But then, the names have changed in that region over the last, 2,000 years. But anyway, somewhere around Afghanistan, they found the remains of an old Buddhist stupa. And inside of it was this little scroll from 2,000 years ago. So that's around the time of Christ, right? So Buddha had only been dead for 500 years by the time they built that stupa. And they didn't know how. They wanted to read it, obviously, but how do you unroll something that's been buried for 2,000 years? And they consulted scroll experts all over the world, and they figured out a way to, hydrate it in some special conditions and unroll it. And in that scroll, it said, these are the words of the Buddha, and it talked about 15 previous Buddhas before our Buddha.
Oh, wow.
And it describes little bios of the previous Buddha's lives. Now, you have to imagine that in what Buddha said was, before the next Buddha, Maitreya, comes up to preach the Dharma again or give the teachings again, we would have already forgot Shakyamuni, our Buddha's teachings, or they would have been so contaminated with other teachings that you couldn't distinguish them anymore as true teachings, right? So we're already moving into 2,500 years since the teachings began. How long is it going to take for the teachings to either totally go away or for them to be totally unrecognizable from other traditions, right? That's a long time, long time. And so if he's saying that there was 15 Buddhas before him, and this is just within this Buddha's memory, I guess you could say that, he might be omniscient or whatever, but he only spoke about 15 Buddhas before his time. But we're talking about a vast span of time. So I just felt it was interesting, whether that has anything to do with reincarnation or not. I don't know if they're saying that it was the same Buddha that came back every time, so he was talking about his own reincarnation, or if it was different. But I'm just talking about the vastness of time is to me, in the Buddhist cosmology, we think of time as this limited thing, where in Buddhism, there's vast universes, vast different, parallel universes and different planets. And so when we talk about reincarnation, it's happening. I might not reincarnate on just this planet. I might have reincarnated on every other planet in the cosmos, right? So we're looking at a huge, vast subject.
I think that's a good point, talking about the cosmological conception of time, right, in the Buddhist perspective. And I think that kind of has some influence on, the way that reincarnation is conceived. Because if you have a vast amount of time, if you're measuring time based on eons, and this comes from the ancient Indian philosophies about where the world came from, and essentially arguing that it's almost limitless. You can look back and not really have an answer. And that sort of makes me think of comparative to time in the sense of Western traditions. I mean, when we think of Christianity, for example, or the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's a certain time where that period starts. There's people often, in our modern era, conservative evangelicals will say, "Oh, the world's only 4,000 or 5,000 years old because that's when Adam and Eve were created by God." And in that span of time, you can imagine that a human life takes up a lot longer period of time. So in that sense, it would almost make logical sense that a human life would come to an end at a certain point, and that would be enough, or that would be kind of there would be some sort of finality to it. Whereas in the Indian conception, things are based on cycles. There's things that go around and around and around, and the human life, eons, all these things are included in that. A lot of Buddhists around the world believe that currently, to get to the point of the future Buddhas and the past Buddhas, currently we're in a degenerative age. And the teachings of the Shakyamuni Buddha were 2,500 years ago. And we might be, well on the way down in terms of the sort of global consciousness that the Buddha's teachings brought to the world. But at a certain point, it'll continue to degenerate until it reaches the point where the Maitreya Buddha, the future Buddha, comes, and then he ushers in sort of a new era. But it kind of makes sense almost in terms of framing a worldview, and then almost coming up with an idea of, or come up with a comparative idea of a human life. How long is that?
Yeah, so it talks about life cycles, right? Each cycle begins with a new Buddha, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be any huge metaphysical thing. It's just a way to put a pin in something and track time when time is so vast and infinite, So then when you get into variations of reincarnation, so like in Tibetan Buddhism, as you know, everything is a bardo. Like when you die, you go through these bardos, right? And maybe Malcolm could speak on this a little better. I don't know. But even there are no dead people. According to Tibetan Buddhism, this is very much a bardo that we're in right now. And we will keep going through bardos until we reach enlightenment and get off this cycle of, birth and death and all these cycles of time that Malcolm is talking about. What we want to do is escape these bardos. Do you have any reference to that teaching?
Yeah, a little bit. Bardo essentially means, I don't know the exact translation from Tibetan, but essentially what it means is an intermittent time, or like a liminal space almost, sort of an in-between. And I think there are 5 bardos, or 6. There's a certain number of bardos, and we know that it is not 0 and it is not infinity. And one of the bardos is the bardo of this life. So the life that you and I currently lead. It's an intermittent space between our birth and our death. Another bardo is the bardo of sleep. It's an intermittent state between consciousness and unconsciousness. One of probably the most famous bardo that comes to mind when we talk about this is the death bardo, and that's the subject of many of kind of the popular esoteric teachings of Tibetan Buddhism that have been exported to the West, like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and it attempts to take this teaching that has very specific instructions of how to treat a human being, or really any being, but the human being especially, because in the Buddhist conception, the human life is the most precious or auspicious life you can be born into, even more so than the gods, because the gods can't attain enlightenment. And so in this teachings of the death bardo, what that process looks like, there are very specific instructions of where someone goes and what happens, the physical changes that happen in the body at the moment of death. And I was present at a teaching one time by Shamtro Rinpoche, I believe, in Dharamsala, and he was teaching on several of these bardos, although he was doing a bardo teaching. And the one day that I was able to go, I think I went to one day of the bardo teachings and one day of the calm abiding meditation teachings. The one day I attended was the death bardo. And to me, it sounded very scientific, because he talked a lot about the different elemental forces in the body that are present and how they change at the moment of death. He talked about how at a certain stage of death, the element of cold, or the temperature, the cold temperature rises and the heat decreases. And that corresponds to sort of a chemical change in the body, the fundamental process of the body shutting down. Likewise, he talked about the element of wind increasing, and so like taking the death gasps that are common, at the moment of death, and the element of water as well. You can think about how the liquid changes in the body and how, the bowels evacuate and things like that. These are very specific. They correspond to periods of time. You can read this book and go through that death process with someone and know exactly at what stage they're at. And there are very specific instructions because, as he said, that the bardo is really one of the most opportune times. The karmas are almost exponentially stronger that you create. So it's all the more important to enter and exit that process in a sort of harmonious fashion. So essentially, what you do in that moment matters, because our Western conceptions of science, we can understand exactly how the body functions, exactly how the death process happens, what changes in the body. But what science doesn't have an answer to as much is how the changes in consciousness and what happens to our consciousness. Where does it go? And because we know that we exist, we have some relative conception of consciousness in relation to ourselves, others, the world we live in. But at that moment of death, that all dissolves. In the Tibetan Buddhist Bardo teachings, as well as other religious teachings, the physical changes correspond exactly to the changes in consciousness. And that has an effect on where you go after you die, after that point where whatever the human being is made up of, sort of a continuous process of karma, what happens to that when it leaves the body? Because there is a point where it does leave the body.
I have a bunch of questions before we get too much farther into this, just so that I'm on the same page. So what you're saying is the Buddhist idea is that you're never, so on a linear sort of scale, you're never dead. So when you die, you immediately are reborn into the next. There is no holding pattern. There's no stopping point. You just roll from one right into the other.
It's a process. The bardo that happens immediately after the death bardo, and again, this is in the Tibetan Buddhist conception.
Right, sure.
Other Buddhist schools have different answers to this. But the bardo immediately after the death bardo is the karmic bardo of becoming. And that is when the karmas that have matured to affect you in your present life, in the human life, cease. And the karmas that are now maturing after the point of death, in the karmas that determine your next life, that is when they will propel that cycle.
So the idea of the karma is that you're not only working towards trying to move forward in your next life and this life, but that it is a computation that's taken throughout this life and is calculated at the end and then processed into where you go next.
Exactly. Certain karmas have those effects. There are several different ways that karma can mature, and many of them have to do with determining the next life, the next birth. So that, in my instance, for example, if I was to die tomorrow and I go through this death bardo process, there's going to be points in my life where my karma, I have unfinished karma, right? And that's from this life and from all previous lives. Any karma that has been unfinished, because every cause has a corresponding effect. It's very Newtonian in a way. And so if my life were to cease and there were unfinished karmas that needed to mature, many of them would mature in that death process, because that is one of the primary ways, in the rebirth process, because that's one of the primary ways that karmas affect one's future lives.
We talk about the relative view and the ultimate view, right? So there's some complicated thinking around all that. You say it's Newtonian, but at the same time, I would venture to say that most Tibetans don't even know how to explain the bardos after death, or even what happens.
Good point.
And I don't think anybody has the answer, really, right? So we're just describing some of the ways that we interpret the Tibetan Book of the Dead, right? But like I say, there's some double talk there, because what is it that reincarnates? The 14th Dalai Lama says that this is the 14th incarnation, but it's the mind stream. It's not a real person that's being reincarnated. It's this mind stream full of past karma and past things and experiences. So the 14th Dalai Lama isn't really the 13th Dalai Lama, is and isn't. So it's like he's born in this different body, and in this body he's having his own experiences, his own values, his own biases, his own practice, completely different than the 13th Dalai Lama. But at the same time, there's some karmic things at play that came along as baggage with the previous lives. You know what I mean?
So can you remember any of how do you benefit? Is it just strictly karmic, or is there any, can you fall back on that prior experience?
Yeah. Let me finish my thought real quick, and then we'll jump in there, because it's like everybody, not just the Dalai Lama, is being reincarnated. Mm-hmm. He's just supposedly the leader of this one sect of Tibetan Buddhism, and he's the leader, and he keeps reincarnating and having this title, the Dalai Lama. But if you're gonna go down this goat trail, and this is your belief, we've all reincarnated in past lives, not just the Dalai Lama, right? But ultimately, that's the relative view. The ultimate view is, what is it? Because the Buddhists said that there is no self, there is no ego, there is no Kylie, and putting into words whatever there is, it's actually doesn't have any attributes that you can really describe. And you could say it's the winds of karma, and then when the winds of karma inhabit a body, it takes on these attributes, but you can't even really put that in human language to describe it, right? So while we can say the Tibetan Book of the Dead says these things, well, then there's other teachings that say that in these bardos, you're trying to be tricked into come back in some incarnate body, right? Either as an animal or a long-lived god, or in the hell, one of the 7 hells in Tibetan Buddhism. But along in the bardos, it's your own mind trying to trick you to go in the wrong direction, so that you wind up in an animal animal realm or a long-lived God realm or another realm or back in the human realm. And so what that all means and why is that happening and why is it so hard to go to the clear light and escape all that? It's almost unfathomable because relatively it's happening. Ultimately, nothing's happening, and none of this ever happened and never will happen. Because there's nobody here.
Now that you've said that, on an ultimate level, we can't explain any of these things. I'm going to be a know-it-all and try to explain exactly what the soul is.
Okay.
Hey, look, that's how we get close to figuring it all out.
Right.
So, you just you go ahead and
just I'm merely kidding. But what I think we have to address that question, right? What is being reincarnated? Because that exactly one of the central tenets of Buddhism is that there is no self, there is no soul. And speaking of relatively, that idea was created in contrast to the predominant idea of self at the time, which is the Atman, or the soul, really, in Hindu thought. And that in Hinduism, that is what is being reincarnated. It is one thing. And to me, this is what is different about Buddhism, is that instead of one thing being reincarnated, it is instead many things. It is instead many aggregates, many finite pieces of, arguably, of matter that are continually manifesting and dissipating at once. And those things are then propelled by karma. That is the force that is moving that forward, moving that into the next life. And to me, that is what is different about the Buddhist conception of the soul, is that it is many finite things instead of one infinite thing. So there are Buddhists that would say that they have a soul, they have a self. In Mongolia, for example, there's a idea of a sunesu, or soul, or self, and that's like a very heroic sort of thing. It's something to take pride in and to take refuge in your idea of self. But that seems to contrast Buddhism because the lines are very fine there.
So is it so getting back to my prior question, when you reincarnate and you are moving forward, or the essence of you is moving forward, the karmic wave is moving forward, can you
surf's up, dude?
I'm sorry.
Surf's up, dude.
So is there any recollection of the prior self at all? Is there anything, because as we get older in this life, right, you start off as a child, you learn, you go to school, you get beat up, each process is a process of learning until you get older to where you say, now I'm much wiser than I was. Logically, it would make sense if you could carry that to the next life, you would, be a little closer to maybe being enlightened. If you're a monk and you've spent your entire life studying, you now get to carry that to your next life. Can you, in the Buddhist idea, can you recall that? Is that something you can carry with you, or is that got wiped away and now you're just this wave that's now back in the body to build more karma as you go along?
It would seem that way, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so I speaking from a personal experience, I think that I had a situation where I remembered at least like 6 to 8 of my past lives. But so I was working at this place, and I won't go into great detail, but on my lunch break, I would go into this room and take a nap. And I would sit in this chair and lay my head back for a little while and rest my eyes. And one day I went in there and I laid my head back, and as soon as my head touched the wall, it was like boom, 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 boom. I saw like 6, 8, like past lives. And I woke up like, what the heck was that? But even though I knew it was me, I wasn't me. In other words, the mind stream had gone through those bodies. I was and I wasn't them. So I was like an observer seeing when I was a Dutch farmer. And I knew it was me, but I didn't really know them. You know what I'm saying? So how much we actually learn from each life, I don't know if I read this or I assume it, that we are getting better as we progress and working on various aspects. But, you could work on various aspects of yourself for an infinite amount of time, and I hate to keep going back to it, but I think ultimately what we're trying to realize is that there is no true self and no need to reincarnate again, because whatever this is, we are already that. The Dharmakaya, or the you can use various names for that. Ultimately, whatever reality is, whatever these things are that are in this mind stream, in these mind streams, it's all of us. But what we do is we make an ego out of it, right? So this mind stream is inside of all of us right now. I'm calling this Kylie, and this Malcolm, and this Josh, and so forth, right? But it's really the same thing. We're just calling it by different names, which, some people would say is a more Hindu philosophy. So, you can split hairs here, but what I also think is interesting is other traditions and other religions have another concept of afterlife. And there's just as many books on not only, there's plenty of books about proof of reincarnation, but there's probably more, the same amount or more. I saw Jesus. I saw the light. There was an angel. My grandmother was waiting for me after I died,
Heaven is for real.
And heaven is for real. There was a neurosurgeon recently that came out with a book that didn't believe in an afterlife because he was a neurosurgeon. I mean, he medical man talked about Newtonian, but when he died, he came back saying, okay, like I was flying and there was like huge, colorful, other realms out there that I traveled through, So I don't think Buddhists have a lock on the afterlife. I don't think Christians do. I don't think the Hindus. I don't think anybody really knows.
I think what's interesting about reincarnation is that almost every religion has their own version. Mm-hmm. The only difference is other religions, they're only the highest are prescribed to be reborn. So if you take Jesus, he is the only one reborn. Everyone else will go to, heaven or hell based on whatever their actions are, but he's the only one that gets to come back. If you get into the Scientologists, only the highest levels will come back as the highest levels and be better. Everyone else is striving towards that. So I think almost every religion has some version of that, except for I think maybe Jews that are hoping that that will happen with the highest and hasn't yet. So, but there's a lot, Hindus, and then there's a lot of actual science based on reincarnation that's not related to any religion necessarily. That there's been a lot of research done on that has sort of at least come up with some interesting facts, I guess you could say, based on that.
That's a good point that you bring up about the level of spiritual practice that correlates to almost deserving reincarnation. Because when you ask the question about remembering your past lives, to me, in the way I've learned about Buddhism, it's always been correlated with the higher sort of attainment you get in your realization or awakening. That is when you are able to almost gain that skill, that ability to remember your past lives. It's said that in the Buddha's actual awakening, he remembered his past lives right before his own moment of awakening, when he was able to focus his mind and apply his sort of realizations to the ideas, to the concepts of karma and of impermanence, and when he attained all his major awakenings, right in that moment he saw his past lives and then he was enlightened. That's kind of the predominant narrative around the Buddha's awakening story, and I've heard that as well from other folks. To me, it's always one of the most impressive things, and it gives me confidence and sort of inspiration when I can see people that have clearly made it so much further than I have in my own life, and they've claimed to have these sorts of realizations. So
What I have always thought was interesting about that story is after Buddha, after his awakening, he said, "There's no way to articulate what I know. I'm not going to tell anybody. There's no way I can explain this."
Sure, Buddha.
And the gods came down and said, "Please teach. Please try at least," because the gods say, "I know that we don't exist forever. It seems like as gods, we've always been around and will always be around, but even we don't know how to get off the wheel of reincarnation, right?" And so in the Buddhist, they say that the gods, the Hindu gods and all the other gods came and asked Buddha to please speak, please try at least to teach this, How true that is, we don't know, but it just goes back to saying that.
I think something that you have to consider with this, though, is that even though one of the ideas is that you don't exist and your ego is simply the construct that holds, this idea of self together, these people talk from a point of view of ego. So the idea that the gods came down and said, "Oh, now that you've woken up, can you please disseminate this to everyone else?" There is a form of ego that goes in with that. If there's not a form of ego, then why do these deities take a higher seat? Because I'm awoke, right? I understand this. Therefore, I take a higher seat than you do. Let me disseminate. So the idea of teacher, from a certain standpoint, has a degree of ego involved in it. So, going back to a prior podcast where we talk about the monkey mind, regardless of how incredible this entity is, right, that we are, or we are a part of, or we're a wave, or however you want to break it down, we still have to exist in this realm. And in this realm, that form takes the form of a body, and in that body, part of that seems to come with an ego. So regardless of how far away you try to get with that, it still seems to be this sort of thing. And an interesting idea about when I'm listening to this about the Buddhist is that it's universal. So it takes in the idea that there is a universe, which goes farther than some religions, and that in that universe there are more than just us in it, which again goes farther than some other. But in that, this is a single small story in a huge universe. So we are only one small part, and I say small part only because of the size of the universe and the size of us in it, in a larger story. So for all we know, we are the thumbnail of the universe. If you were to look at yourself and say, you think about the body, it's full of cells, and there's higher cells and there's lower cells, and they all have jobs to do, and they all live in their own little worlds, right? So in the universe, we're a thumbnail. That it's just that simple. So you, every day, your goal is to accomplish, to be something better than where you came from. Whether it's on the individual level of I'm a person who's trying to be better, or I'm part of a larger wave moving through the universe, that's your goal, right? So I think that Buddhism is interesting in that, and Hinduism sort of takes a little bit from that, but not, I
think it's vice versa.
You think so?
Well, I mean, if you're looking at it, the Buddhism borrowed a lot from
Absolutely,
Hinduism, and it modified it heavily because it was rebelling against the dominant philosophical treatise of the time, or the Brahmanical institution. And Jainism arose at the same period of time. There are major schools of Indian thought that are still around today and in the minority, but they came from that point. It was like a reformation almost. And it mutated into something completely different. But on the scale of talking about the scale of the universe in Hinduism and Buddhism and those traditions, I also find it fascinating because I find it to be a more sustainable viewpoint something that takes into account more than just the community. There are people that matter more than just my people and the people that agree with me. And to me, that was one of the original attractive things about this tradition, and I think it leaves a lot of room for self-exploration as well, for you to add your own ideas as well. And it's also fascinating that these concepts have been around since before recorded history practically. It's really astounding.
So I don't want to dominate this with Buddhism, even though that's essentially who we have here. But when we talk about the afterlife, there's a few different ideas. So there's reincarnation, and then there is an idea of a heaven and a hell, okay, and even a purgatory, spread out through other religions. So there's some that I don't know very much about, and I don't really want to comment too much on. Hopefully you know more about them than I do. But
we'll see.
So we'll talk about Christianity specifically. Okay.
Who here in this room grew up Christian?
I think most everybody did.
Yeah. Well, in the West, everything, whether you ever went to church or not, it predominates our everything.
Yeah, this country was founded by Puritans, so
it affects our worldview just growing up around it.
The United States is a Christian nation.
Yeah.
It's difficult to say that it's not the case.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in the Christian beliefs, whether you go Catholic or Protestant or any of the different hundreds of denominations that are out there, there is a basic heaven, hell, purgatory sort of idea.
Well, I was going to say that I found it really shocking when I found out that so do Buddhists, right? There's the Amitabha Buddha, and created a Pure Land, which is like a heaven, and this form of Buddhism looks very much like Christianity.
They call it the Protestant Buddhism.
The Protestant Buddhism, so you pray these prayers, and it's all about almost like remission of sins kind of deal.
You're born into the Pure Land in some instances based on faith alone.
Right, and nothing that you can do to deserve it. It's Amitabha and the vow that he took that will get you there. So let me break that down a little bit, and then I'll give Malcolm opportunity to jump in. But
or Josh, getting back,
yeah.
reining us in.
Yeah. But so they say that there was this bodhisattva that chose not to become a Buddha. He was right on the verge of becoming a Buddha, and because of the bodhisattva vow, the vow to come back and help all people, instead of becoming a Buddha, he said that actually, you know what? He did become a Buddha, but a certain type of Buddha. He said, I refuse to become a Buddha unless, and then there was a series of things that he wanted to happen before he became a Buddha. Now, who he was talking to, I have no idea, right? But he was saying, do you remember this? Unless I become a Buddha, and I will not become a Buddha unless there is a pure realm where people, when they die, can go to this pure realm and be closer to enlightenment, where there's less suffering and less everything. The conditions are better for them to become Buddhas. And so these list of demands. And after these lists of demands were acquiesced or something, then he became a Buddha, and this world was created, right? And so now this certain type of Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhists, they say, I can never do anything to deserve enlightenment. But because of this vow, I trust Amitabha to, with my soul or my spirit or whatever, that when I die, I'll be born in this Pure Land where I'm only inches from enlightenment, So it's very ritualistic and prayer, and there's this savior, and there's this heavenly realm and all this stuff in Buddhism also.
Exactly. I mean, the hell realms are another example of that. There's based on your karma, you can go to hell in the Buddhist sort of wheel of life is how that's commonly framed. And at the the lowest realm. It's torture. It resembles, Dante's Inferno. You're burning off all your wicked karmas, things that happen when you choose to take someone else's life. And they say that the most potent karma is that which comes from killing, that which comes from intentionally taking the life of any sentient beings, not just a person. And so those are the most negative karmas that can lead you to go to that lowest sort of realm. And it was said that the Buddha himself, went through those realms many times on his journey on the journey of the Bodhisattva, the journey to become the Buddha and to attain his ultimate awakening. Some of the other ones there's a realm of hungry ghosts or pretas that are creatures that are they're invisible to us, but they have these huge distended bellies and necks that are thinner than a needle, and they're just so hungry and suffering in that existence, in that state for a certain period of time until they die, and then they're reborn. And even the animal realm is seen as one of the hell realms, one of the lower realms, because being born as an animal, there's constant threat of being eaten, of dying, and the wilderness, and you are acting based on instinct. There's no rationality there, and it's said that even we conceptualize pets as having such a leisurely life and being, if only I could be a dog or a cat and just relax and live in the lap of luxury. Well, certain teachers have said that if you were to experience the suffering that a house dog has for just a moment, it would propel you infinitely much more to be motivated to attain enlightenment, because even that suffering is so profound.
Well, it's a lack of purpose, I would imagine. If you take someone, why is prison so bad? Prison is so bad is because you're restricted and you have no purpose. That's the whole idea. And a pet is essentially, we say, their idea of what their job is to give me love when you want it, when you're open for it, when you feel like you want to pay attention to that pet, you pay attention to that pet. So I completely understand that version of that. But so the idea is that every religion has, to some degree, a level of heaven or hell or purgatory, really.
Potentially. They say that that the Jewish idea of hell or the Jewish idea of an afterlife is one of the great sort of like almost blank answers, one of the great sort of unknowns in religious traditions, and Reform Judaism has kind of expounded on that a lot, as far as I know, but I'm not a scholar of Judaism, but apparently it's not really addressed very much in the Torah and the Talmud, in the Jewish text. It's very much focused on this life, and the afterlife is sort of left up to imagination in a way, almost like our conception of science.
So all religions have a goal-orientated sort of idea of the afterlife. The idea of either you get reincarnated in a better level, you get the rewarded in some way, you get to live in a wonderful place. So we talk about how these religions believe in the afterlife, but there are a lot of instances where there is no religion involved, but these people have experiences of the afterlife. They have experiences of reincarnation. They have an experience of hell, or I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Nasa Loar or whatever that is, that was written by a South American man that talked about the afterlife, that he became enlightened or woke, whatever it was, through really no fault of his own, and suddenly had the entire world of the afterlife opened to him, and he wrote about it. And the idea was he didn't really know how to write. He was an illiterate child and all this sort of stuff, and suddenly he knew how to write in several different languages. So, and then he wrote a series of books based on exactly what the afterlife was. And his account was partially scientific, obviously partially sociological. So that idea of what he wrote about was that there were, once you die, if there is a hell, you create it based on what your life was. If you feel guilt, if you feel like there's unfinished business, then you kind of place yourself in this sort of place until you've realized that, you love is the way and all that. If you've ever seen Where Dreams May Come, that was a movie with
Robin Williams.
Robin Williams, yeah. It sort of kind of goes along that sort of line. Then once you figure that out, you kind of go to this other place that's a much more loving and caring. So there is no real hell. It's necessarily just sort of this place where if you die under circumstances where you're not quite ready, you don't understand, you go here until you sort of figure it out. Then you go to this other place, and from there you decide whether you want to come back or not, what sort of, and it's a very structured idea. And scientifically, the idea is that this exists in the magnetosphere around the planet. So in between the levels of, in between the magnetic levels of the Earth's magnetic field is where this electrical sort of impulse that we are goes and exists. But this is not based on any religion necessarily. This is someone's supposed account of how this all works. So it kind of goes into reincarnation. There's several children that have been supposedly reincarnated. They remember their prior lives. There's one kid based out of Louisiana. He was supposedly reincarnated from a World War II pilot that crashed his Corsair. I think it was the Leyte Gulf. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is where he perished. He could recall people's names from a World War II cruise book. He knew the person's name. He remembered the airplane crash. His father was very much against the whole thing and thought that reincarnation was a bunch of bunk. And so his whole idea was he was going to prove it wrong. He turned out to become sort of a believer in it because all of the things that his son brought up and all the things he recognized, they actually took him to meet his old squadron mates. So there's a lot of scientists that are involved in actually figuring this stuff out. So Christopher Bach actually did, or was reported on a study that was done where they took a lot of these children's accounts and they actually broke them down into scientific levels where they had like so many children under the age of 8 usually seemed to be where they would recall these instances up until puberty. And it seemed to be either between 8 when they started going to school and interacting with other kids all the way until they hit puberty. And then it sort of all goes away. 65% of those children, their prior lives ended in some sort of catastrophic ending where either it was a terrible death or there was unfinished business. So women who died in childbirth, there's an instance of a man who got hit by a train in India, which is a common occurrence there. That little girl actually had the birthmarks on her chest from where the man that had died before that she became. His ribs were broken and were pushed through his skin. She had the birthmarks where his ribs were broken. So also they seem to be roughly within the same family group, and anywhere from 2.5 to 3 years in between the death and the reincarnation. So a good point that they brought up was because if it's a scientific study, only those very direct, very traumatic instances is something that could be studied. So they're guessing the other 45% just happens to be almost kind of luck that they've run into these children because they weren't necessarily traumatic, but they did seem to roughly, fall into the same categories. So other than religion, there's a lot of science behind this. There's a lot of science behind the afterlife. There's a lot of people out there that have experienced, that have, had a near-death experience or actually had a death experience and been brought back to life and have a lot of information to to give on this, and it is first person, just like anything else, really. It's based off of somebody's thought process behind this, is somebody's interpretation of what happened to them or what they're experiencing. In this study, they talked specifically about a little girl who they said, I want you to sit down and I want you to imagine another person. Okay. I want you to imagine a little friend. Okay. And in this friend, I want you to describe to me what they look like, where they live, their name, all of this very specific information out of this 5-year-old little girl. And she sat down and she said, okay, well, her name is, and I'm wrong with the names and the hair colors and all that, 'cause I don't remember specifically, but she said her name is Susie. She lives on Elm Street. She has red hair. She wears glasses. She wears a pink dress with yellow flowers. She wears black patent shoes. So he writes all of this information down. Okay. And then he goes and searches and he finds a little girl named Susie who died at the same exact age that this girl was talking about, wearing the same dress, wearing the same shoes, same color hair, same everything. So this child, who supposedly doesn't know anything about this other child, described this child to a T. Is that reincarnation? That's the trick. Does it become also where we're waves? Okay, we're waves passing through, and it so happens that this wave picked up this one kid and put it in. So I think it's an interesting way to look at this. Religion is simply a lens to look through the afterlife. It doesn't necessarily have to be based on a religion, which personally I feel like kind of breaks down the barriers between the religion. Because if you look at it as simply a lens, a way you choose to understand it, then what does it matter what lens you look through?
I think what seems to matter is, in that instance, what is true? Like, what is the actual fact of the matter? And I think that's really fascinating, examining these concepts in isolation from various cultural influences, from religious influences, whatever, trying to get at something substantive or objective, right? What is the objective fact of the matter? What is the science of death, and where do we go? And I think to me, I think it's difficult to argue that Buddhism is not more than just a lens with which I observe the world and my spirituality and the ways and our society, our reality. And when I think about it in that way, when I almost question it and compare it relative to other people's lenses, it seems like we're all trying to get at something. We're all trying to get an objective understanding. We're all trying to make a claim about what the objective nature of reality is and the objective nature of death and where do we go when we die. And I think on a scientific level, we may be able to answer that, we may not. But it seems like there is something beyond any of these lenses, any of these cultural aberrations and understandings of what is relatively true. That ultimate level.
Yeah, and I agree with that. It reminds me of not last week's show, but the week before, about the UFO expert that we had, the historian. When he said UFO, he literally meant it's unidentified, right? That was pretty interesting to me that he came from that, not necessarily as a believer, but he's saying, we know it's not a plane, we know it's not a craft, we know it's not a light, it's not gas, it's unidentified, right? And so I think that what we have here is this phenomena that we're all trying to figure out and using these various lenses, right? And then you go down one goat trail and it's like people believe past lives, But then the very next person you study, they believe in heaven, and then the very next person that you encounter say that no, you go to the Great Spirit in the sky, and there's a dancing ceremony forever and ever and ever, and then you go to the throne room of God where you're worshiping with all the angels for all eternity. And so I think there are these motifs and these archetypes that keep coming up all over the world. And although they're a little different, they're also at the core a lot of the same too, So, there's something there. And even now more and more people are taking these ayahuasca trips and going to Peru, and it's almost a form of death. They go through the whole process of feeling judged. They're judging themselves. They're seeing all the things that they had done wrong in their life. It's almost like a past life review while they're still in this life and still alive. They're seeing how bad they treated their sister and how bad they treated their mom. And there's gut-wrenching kind of like judgment. They're judging themselves. And then at the end, usually they break through into some kind of enlightened kind of understanding of the bigger picture of it all,
It almost makes me wonder if we were to take, because what you're saying is true, is that there's always some sort of reflection of similarity, that these different ideas are reflections of one another, and they're trying to get at the same thing. It almost makes me think of if we took all of the sort of authoritative figures in all these different traditions, someone who's done 100 ayahuasca trips, take the Dalai Lama, take Pope Francis, and get them all together in a room and have them discuss the afterlife. And each of them shares their beliefs, what they know to be true, what they take to be true. And then if we were to combine them and take everything that's similar and leave everything that else is just completely different, what would we get? What would that be? Could you aggregate it and average everybody's understanding of what the afterlife is, and then make a claim about what objectively we're dealing with?
I think if you were to just look at our history, each time someone comes out and they say, I've got all the answers, there's a group of people that will get together and say, you do have all the answers, and I like what you're telling me right now. And then after a little while, they go, I'm not sure whether this guy's on the right path or not. I've been thinking about this. Maybe it's like this, but it's a little different than that. And it goes, and so here you have offshoots of every major religion ever. I think ultimately it's always seems to be our goal, and has been, to figure out what the afterlife is all about. And it could be that maybe that's one of the things that, if you follow the either the scientific or the religious version of reincarnation, maybe that's something that we agreed not to understand. Maybe part of that attainment is a carrot to try to reach the ultimate goal, which is to be better people. If we all understood it, if we all knew what it was, then why would we be here? We already know what we're walking into when we're done. We have a finite lifespan, okay, according to each person. I mean, it's, but roughly around.
You do, but you might, but you're not. You
There's
same
well, no, I mean in this body, the existence in this body is finite, right? So, part of that reasoning, I would feel like, I mean, if you look at, again, history, the reason behind that is because if it was limitless, if you understood that you want to believe that you're continuous, that you never end. But if you knew you never ended, well, would you be as concerned with trying to figure everything out when the time that you're here?
Yeah.
For that point, maybe that's the part of the Buddhist idea that you no longer get in this cycle anymore, because you've already figured out this is, there's no point in me coming back. There's no point in me continuing to do this. I've been a grasshopper, I've been a bird, I've been a dog, I've been a human. Maybe in that circle, elephants and pigs and dolphins are, higher than we are in that cycle to figure things out. In any case, you no longer need to come back. So therefore, you no longer need to forget where you came from. you know.
Well, here's something that I find interesting, right? So there is that thing that we don't want to believe there's going to be a time when we don't exist, right? And so we could try to create this afterlife or try to create a religion or a belief or something where we'll never not exist, right? But from my own life, there was a situation with my ex-mother-in-law, and see if I can remember this correctly. So when my ex-mother-in-law was on her deathbed, they brought her home to die at home, right? So there was a hospital bed in the living room. They moved out the couch and everything and put the hospital bed. And I'll never forget that I would go there and visit her, even though I was divorced from her daughter and all that stuff. She was still very dear to me or whatever. And they told me that she was having conversations with not her grandmother, but her dad's. I'm trying to remember exactly. So she had a close relationship with her mother and her grandmother, right? But that's not who she was talking to. She was talking about to her husband's mother, whom she had never met. So when she married her husband, he had already died. And so she didn't know his grandfather. But even when I was married to her daughter, we would spend all our holidays down on the border of Louisiana, is Orange, Texas. Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year's, whatever, every holiday, we're down there visiting her mother and her grandmother, And so when she was actually dying, her mother and her grandmother had already passed away. So naturally, you would think that if somebody was going to come comfort her in her time of dying, it would be her own mother and her own grandmother. But it wasn't. It was her husband's grandfather who had died that she had never met. And so that what had always confused me. If we're making this stuff up, why would she make up somebody that she had never met? And she would have conversations, and they were like, where she could describe what he looked like and all these things that were like personal to this person, right? And her husband was like, oh my God, she's talking to my father. You know what I mean? Why is she talking to my father? He died when I was a kid or whatever. You know what I mean? And so there's some really weird things that come into play here about, yeah, that could be made up, but why would they make it up like that? That's pretty particular. You know what I mean? And then there are people that come back with some knowledge, like this book that you said. This guy wrote a whole book I've never read, or several books or whatever. Sometimes they do come back and say things that are like, they're either tapping into a greater intelligence, or they really were given this information from beyond. You know what I mean?
It's those anomalies that really make you think that you don't have all the answers.
So, getting close to closing, I think I think it's beneficial in this particular instance, kind of like in the UFO one that we did a couple weeks ago. What is your belief in the afterlife? So we'll start with Kylie and then move around.
Wow. Yeah, I probably take some criticism from Buddhists, but I think I more than quite often say that I'm Buddhish, right?
How dare you?
I'm not necessarily, even though I have a lama and I'm widely read in Buddhism and practice aspects of it, I am not officially Buddhist. So I have this understanding that, and it's partially science, right? You put anything under a microscope and you look at it, it breaks down to smaller parts. And even, we keep coming up with stronger microscopes and finding smaller parts until you get just pure energy. We don't have a microscope to go further than just pure energy. So from a scientific quantum physics lens, nothing really exists. It's made of smaller and smaller particles and you can't find any matter there. In other words, there is no solid thing. There's no BB that's completely solid when you get to the core of it, right? Even that what you would find would be the hard thing is broken down to smaller and smaller, and mostly it's empty space, right? Unidentifiable. I can say this is a quark or a neutron or an atom or whatever. Most of that, those are just labels that I'm calling this thing. And then the stuff around it, I'm just calling empty space because we haven't named that yet. Dark matter or something, right? So if that's true on a physical plane, how much more so can I believe that this whole thing is spiritual? It's thought. It's the part of whatever the source is. And when we try to figure it out by looking through various lenses, like we said, but it's very much like being in a dream. You go down one goat trail and it takes you down another goat trail and takes you down, and it's that carrot at the end of the stick, you know? And so I think Buddha is a good example of somebody that ultimately might have quit thinking about it in some way. And I know, and there's several traditions that say whatever it is, you're already it. Like there's no reason to chase it. Don't stop trying to wake up because you are already awake. It's like anything that you're going to find at the end of that goat trail, or when you finally grab the carrot, you're going to realize you've always been that. There's no transmutation or anything. You just suddenly realize, oh, I already am the universe. I already know God. I've already lived 1 billion lifetimes. Oh, I'm already that. There's no change. No change at all. So ultimately, in Tibetan Buddhism, they say the dreamlike nature of reality. I really feel like, this is kind of a dream world that we're living in that is self-created. And whatever is creating that, when I say self, is the ultimate self. Now, where that came from or what it is, I have no idea. I can't go any further than that. But I think ultimately we are that. We are the Buddha nature. We are the Buddha. We are the Bodhisattva. We are anything that we can read about. We're already that thing. And I think we pretend and play with ourselves because it's fun to keep reincarnating and pretend like we don't know. So that's what I believe.
Kylie, that was a beautiful and eloquent way to dodge the question.
Thank you. I try.
And we love you for it.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what I believe about death, and I think it really does come down to belief and what I choose to believe. Because at a very early age, I was very terrified by the thought of death, and especially by the answers that I was given about where I am going to go when I die. I wanted to go to heaven. I didn't want to go to hell. I was really scared that maybe I had it wrong and I was going to go to hell. And I was really also very scared that the doubts that I was having was going to also cause me to go to hell because I didn't really believe. And that sort of anxiety continued all the way up until I just decided to set it down and that it wasn't good for me to keep going round and round in circles and anxiously, thinking about this sort of thing. So that's one of the things that drove me away from Christianity at an early age. And, I have no sort of malice towards it. I used to be pretty angry and, resentful, but, I can't predict the future. Who knows? I might circle back to my Lutheran roots at some point. There's no sort of animosity there. But what the revelation in that experience was that I can choose my own spirituality, that I can create my own journey, one that suits me well. And in terms of, what happens, I began to grow more comfortable with not knowing. And for a while, that was also my refuge. And who knows? I don't know. I'm cool with whatever happens, I just don't think, I think I might be very optimistic about it, but I just don't feel that, that there's punishment in a universal way, I don't feel like it's almost like the problem of evil, right? Like how could a just God create a world with suffering in it and with evil in it? And I almost think, how could a just creator create a hell, to punish his creation? That just doesn't jive with me. So at this point, I would say that I ultimately don't know, and that it is a big question mark, but I am considering the Buddhist perspectives, as well as others that I learn about. But what I find is very interesting in spirituality and has been illuminating for me recently has been to consider new alternatives and to consider different ways of looking at the world. And right now I'm exploring Buddhism. I find that it explains a lot of the way the world works and the way my mind works, and even the privileges that I've been given in this life, and it has answers for that. So I wouldn't say that it is the objective truth in my reality, but I am considering that it's up to karma, and that hopefully the work that I'm doing in this life and in the present moment to try to bring wisdom and good fortunes to other people, as well as train my mind and improve my current state of being, that whatever those efforts are, they're placed in the right way. And I hope that something will see that and recognize that was the right thing to do. That's really what I hope. But it's almost like a game. It's almost like a thought exercise, but in a very long-term sort of manner.
Josh, you're next, buddy.
Yeah,
you're
next.
not gonna just ask the question.
The answers.
Yeah. So I've sort of alluded to this earlier. My feelings on this plane of existence are that we spend a lot of time trying to explain and put everything in a perspective that we can understand to make ourselves feel better at this point in our existence. Ultimately, we know what happens, and if we reach a point where we're ready for it, we can certainly figure it out before we get there. But I think that we are all travelers in the universe, that we've all existed in other parts of the universe as different things at different times. This is our time to be here and to figure things out now, that we are not here necessarily to figure out what happens in the afterlife. We will get there. If you start a trip to, Colorado, you know that your goal is Colorado. You know that's where you're headed, and that the idea is not necessarily the goal, but the trip. How you get there. We're not here to figure out the afterlife. We're here to figure out life and how we can be better people. How we can try to help each other. And if we focus too deeply on the afterlife, we're going to miss, why we're here. And I think trying to put it in a group of words or say that it's called heaven or it's called hell or it's called the cycle or Valhalla or whatever you want to put it in is fine, but it's not the idea. That's not that I feel as though shouldn't be our goal. It shouldn't be what we focus on specifically. It's interesting, and it's a study in what we're afraid of and what we want. It's an interesting idea that we place on ourselves to explain something we can't understand at this level, but that kind of what Kylie said, that we should pay attention to where we're at now and not worry so much about where we're going necessarily,
So you're not going to get tricked into trying to answer this question.
Well, I mean, my
Well, you didn't answer it either.
I said I'm cool with not knowing.
But that's still not an answer.
Well, exactly.
Knowing is not an answer.
And I think
we're basically saying the same thing. We
I know.
don't
I agree.
know.
And I think
that is our answer.
I think that's my answer.
Know.
I think that's my answer too. And that it's almost a question that's not worth trying to answer. Because
is there an answer?
Fun to talk about.
No, it's great, and we've killed several
because
dozens of minutes doing that. And
this show
our
would be
listeners have too.
The show would be a lot different if there was a fundamentalist Christian sitting here,
certainly,
and a fundamentalist, Hindu, and a fundamentalist, somebody believed in Islam. They would have some very definitive answers.
Absolutely.
It just so happens that the three of us can sit down and say, we believe whatever day it is and time it is and what we're reading. We sample different things, but ultimately none of us know, Yeah. So I don't have to kill you to make you believe what I believe.
Absolutely.
I don't have to injure anyone or try to debate you because I myself don't know.
Well, that's a whole nother podcast, but fundamentalism in any view, whether it be social, political, religious, is a hard line in a certain direction.
Yeah.
And so that hard line is going to obliterate anything else in its way and is simply going to say, this is the truth.
And it exists in Buddhism too.
Oh, I'm sure it exists in every view. It's a very safe view.
I think we pretend that Buddhism is this one thing and it's all beautiful. Tibet was wrecked with schisms and different schools, and one of the main things that they did was debate each other, and they transformed that into a way of learning. So if you can articulate something, you can learn it, right? So it was a teaching tool, but at the same time, people hated each other.
There's schools that don't even exist anymore because
they've put them out of business because they were, criticized and ostracized and pushed out, and so that's a whole other podcast in itself. But some people, sometimes I'll say something and someone say, "Well, that's not very Buddhist of you." I'm like, "Oh, if you knew, buddy." You knew.
You talked about
how many people were enslaved in the name of Buddhism.
It's not monolithic.
Yeah.
So in closing, Malcolm, do you have any last words of wisdom?
All of your 21 years or 22 years of studying this material.
I've lived it.
You're closer to the last life than we are.
Exactly.
You probably understand more.
I might have a better chance to remember some stuff before.
You're closer to heaven and the past life than...
I gotta stop killing my brain cells.
A lot closer to 8 than we are.
Right.
I think the one thing that one thing that I've realized lately that I'd like to share is just don't lie to yourself, man. If you know something that you're doing that... I think people ultimately know the difference between wholesome and unwholesome behavior, and the difference is lying to yourself about and deluding yourself about excuses to continue doing that behavior. So I would say whatever you're doing that if you know you should be doing it differently, just act on it, man. Quit lying to yourself and live your truth, because that's something that I'm definitely trying to do in my life, and I think that overall, but I would also like to thank you guys for having me on the podcast. I'm immersed myself in this world of study and debate and humanities, and as in my senior year of college, and pretty soon I'm gonna emerge from that. And it's nice to know that there's things going on in the world that I can continue to engage in to stimulate this part of my mind. So thank you so much, and I look forward to hopefully being on the podcast in the future.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you,
Malcolm. All right, so that's shooting episode 5 in the head and putting her to bed. And my name is Kylie. I'm the monk,
and I'm the mechanic, Josh, and we will see you next time.